In 1945, on a quiet October evening in the sprawling urban city of Houston, Texas, a boy was born. Nobody knew it at the time, but this boy would go on to become the most mysterious man in the history of music. Her story begins in 1978, when a label by the name of Corwood Industries was silently founded with no advertisement or connection to the industry. The label released an album the same year called Ready for the House under the artist name The Units. It had the number 0739 before its title, and the album cover was cryptic, giving off an unsettling feeling. It looks like something you'd find in the backroom short horror film, the music matching this eerie aesthetic with sparse vocals and out-of-tune guitar plucks. Shortly after the album was released, Corwood Industries would receive a cease and desist order from a band named Units claiming that they were infringing on their trademark. Every album release from Corwood after this happened began to be attributed to an unknown artist called Jandek. This was the first time the Jandek alias appeared, and it would be the start of a multi-decade-long investigation into the person behind the Jandek moniker. The scope of this mystery is unusually strange. Huge names in the music industry like Kurt Cobain have name-dropped Jandek, and many journalists and publications have written pieces about him pondering about the identity of the man. At the same time, mainstream attention on his story outside music publications and industry insiders was very scarce. Who is he, and what are his motives? This is the Jandek conspiracy. The search for Jandek's true identity began in 1980 with a radio personality and journalist named Erwin Chusid who was particularly interested in strange and obscure music. A coworker at their radio station called WFMU in New Jersey handed him a copy of Ready for the House on vinyl and winked at him saying, "I think you'll find this very unusual." When he got home, he played each song on the record, but skipping the second, only to find that they sounded nearly identical, each just as unpleasant as the next. Erwin described the music as not simply unlistenable, but unashamedly repellent. He was puzzled by what was in front of him and needed answers, so he found the address printed on the jacket of the album that read P.O. Box 15375, Houston, Texas 77220. With the address in hand, he wrote a letter to Corwood Industries. October 20th, 1980. To whom? A friend passed along a copy of Ready for the House. I've listened to it 3 times. I lied, and I've concluded it's one of the most frightening albums I've ever heard. It's horribly grotesque. I've run out of adjectives to describe the shock of this record. Can you give me any information? Who's on it? It could be the worst record ever released, but somebody went to a lot of trouble putting it together, and I want to know why. I am mystified. It could be the greatest record ever released. I can't figure it out, but every time I place it on the turntable, it's like stepping into the Twilight Zone. Can you help? He attached his address and phone number to the letter and sent it off, patiently waiting for a reply. 2 weeks went by, and much to his surprise, he got a call from Corwood Industries with a man named Sterling Smith speaking on the phone. This phone call was not recorded, but parts of it were documented by Erwin. It was the match that lit the fuse in the search for Jandek's true identity, and it contained one of the first clues as to who Jandek was. On the call, Erwin recounted Sterling rambling in a monotone voice and giving him ambiguous answers to his questions. But one line stood out amongst the rest, which was when Sterling asked, "Do you know any stores that will carry my records?" It's subtle, but Sterling referring to the records as my records could mean one of 2 things. Either he was referring to the physical records printed by Corwood Industries that he wanted to sell, or he meant that he was the one who wrote and performed them, meaning he could be Jandek. Erwin kept in contact with Sterling, and he noted that Sterling uttered a similar phrase in another phone call. "Send me some addresses of record stores that deal in my music." Again, Sterling refers to it as my music. We can't know for sure what he meant by these phrases, but they would be the first pieces of circumstantial evidence that people referenced when discussing the mystery of Jandek's identity. In a later correspondence with Irwin, Sterling noted that his words of encouragement gave him the confidence to continue releasing new albums, and he would send Irwin his second studio album in 1981 called 6 and 6. The number 0740 was printed before the title, and the album was sonically similar to Ready for the House. Not much of note. But the album cover art, on the other hand, was much more interesting, as it contained another clue. It featured a black and white image of a young teenage boy staring into the camera in front of some curtains. This boy was an adolescent Jandek, and it marked the first time in his 3-year-long career that anyone saw a photo of him. Every one of Jandek's album covers followed a similar theme. They were strange pictures of locations and objects, or a photograph of himself from various different points in his life. These types of photos only added to the intrigue and almost served as their own separate mystery unrelated to who Jandek really was. Over the next 4 years, Jandek was prolific and released 11 studio albums by 1985. He sent copies to various college radio stations and took out small advertisements in magazines, which were all blank white ads with the text, Jandek on Corwood, P.O. Box 15375, Houston, Texas 77220. This unusual strategy for advertising his music only increased the intrigue surrounding him because he'd refused to promote his music through live shows or interviews. Other than Irwin Schusid, few had ever spoken to him or heard him speak. But in 1985, Jandek would give an audio-only interview with John Truby, a music journalist for Spin magazine. This was the first time ever that Jandek gave an interview, and it would go on to be one of the very few to exist. The tape of the interview wouldn't surface until decades later, but its contents uncovered some previously unknown information. One of the smaller pieces to the puzzle in the tape was the origin of the alias Jandek, revealed around halfway through the interview.
Well, also the name Jandek. Now you explained that to me once, and I forgot it. And
I was speaking with, it was January, and I was speaking with somebody on the phone named Decker. So I just combined the two.
That's great. Jandek.
It seemed to be something that not too many people would pick.
This revelation didn't exactly narrow down the search, but with how little information was out there, anything that he said was scrutinized heavily. Another element that was theorized about were the 4-digit numbers before each album title, with people discussing what they could mean, but this question was also answered in John's interview.
I'm just trying to keep a catalog or a general idea of the order that you release the records, because I want to keep them in order in my record collection. What was the order that they were released? Do you remember?
Started with 0739.
0739.
And went chronologically from there.
Okay, and I see. Okay, so that's the serial numbers on the records and so forth.
Yeah.
Learning that they were simply catalog numbers with no significance was disappointing to some because people thought the numbers were important to figuring out who Jandek was. However, knowing that they meant nothing was at least a consolation because they could be checked off the list of questions surrounding Jandek. A few other details about his personal life could be found scattered across the 50-minute interview, like how he worked as a machinist and that he'd studied music earlier in his life, but not much more than that. After this interview was taped, just like many fleeting pop culture figures such as D.B. Cooper or Amelia Earhart, he suddenly vanished from the public eye without a trace. Traveling forward 1 year in 1986, 4 different radio stations, including WFMU, organized a late-night radio conspiracy called Jandek Across America. They played various Jandek songs for 45 minutes straight from 1:15 a.m. to 2 a.m. With no explanation for the broadcast, people listening were left to speculate about what had just happened. This broadcast was the first time many people were exposed to Jandek's music, and it pushed him further into the public consciousness, causing a new wave of people wanting to know what he was all about. People wrote letters to Corwood Industries asking all sorts of questions, but all they got in return were boxes of Jandek albums with a note asking them to give the albums away to people. This odd distribution method was similar to how you purchased his records, with people rarely buying single albums as he preferred to sell them in bulk. You could buy 25 assorted LPs by mail for just $60 in the 80s, which was a novel concept and only added to the mystique of his character. Even more extraordinary than the bulk album deals, you could buy his albums wholesale, with 1,000 CDs costing $3,000 in 1998. This was almost too absurd to believe with any other artist, but understanding the context around Jandek's past, it almost seemed normal. By 1998, little progress was made in the search for Jandek. Erwin Schusid was getting restless, so he decided to request an interview by writing a letter, and in return was met with a package from Corwood Industries that contained 2 CDs and a handwritten note. "You'll not be forgotten, ever. This story must be crafted from what you know from the music. We cannot provide interviews or other exchanges of information outside the releases at present. It's probable that your crafted story would be more interesting than any other. Intrigue goes a long way sometimes. Please stay in touch, your friends at Corwood." The response from Corwood Industries was not exactly a promising lead, but some new developments would occur only 1 year later in 1999. A journalist for Texas Monthly named Katie Vine was determined to make headway in solving this mystery. She called Corwood Industries and wrote a letter with no response for a month and a half, but then her luck turned around. A man who claimed to be Chris Puccio from Houston Records called her about an order she had placed for Jandek CDs. The call was strange, and Katie was skeptical about the identity of the man on the phone and wondered if it was Jandek because he refused to talk about anything other than the order. Looking through records of people named Chris Puccio that lived in Houston, Texas, I found a man who seemed to fit the bill. He lived in Harris County in Houston during 1999, and he worked at Houston Records at some point, so we can assume that this man did in fact exist and was who he said he was. She hung up the phone assuming it was a dead end and decided to travel to Houston herself to look for Jandek. She researched for weeks on the phone and in offices that held public records in Houston with no success. As she was winding down her search, she decided to ring one last doorbell to a house that may be associated with Corwood Industries. A man opened the garage door, and to her surprise, he looked like a mid-30s version of the boy on Jandek's album covers. She asked the man, "Do you know anything about Corwood Industries?" And he responded, "What do you want to know?" She inquired further about Jandek, but the man seemed uncomfortable with her questions. He looked up and said, "Do you drink beer?" And they went off to a bar to chat further. The man told her to not record their meeting or disclose any personal information, which sounded suspiciously similar to Jandek's past secrecy. He mentioned studying philosophy in college and said, "I am becoming increasingly disinterested with my white-collar career." Katie got the sense that the man wasn't concerned with profit, fame, or any traditional rewards that came along with being a successful musician. During the whole conversation, the man and Katie referred to Jandek in the third person, which was odd. Their time together came to a close, and the man stressed that he didn't want to be contacted by journalists or anyone else about Jandek ever again. Katie was convinced she had been talking with Jandek. All of the dots seemed to connect, but like always, there was not any concrete proof. Katie Vine is one of the only documented cases of someone meeting him in person. This meeting would be the last time anyone would see him for 5 years, as he disappeared back into the ether. In 2003, a documentary called Jandek on Corwood was released, directed by Chad Fredericks, on a limited theatrical run and was later put onto DVD. Because the subject of the documentary was so sensitive, Jandek never appeared on screen in the film. Instead, journalists, DJs, and critics shared stories and theories about Jandek and Corwood Industries, along with discussing his otherworldly music catalog.
And the first thing that came to mind was Jandek.
I understand you have never heard a Jandek song in your life. And I'd like to describe that for you.
When you listen to Jandek, you really sort of have to evaluate what your assumptions are about what counts as rock music.
When you hear a Jandek song, I guess it's more like You have to experience it as an atmosphere, to me at least, more than as a song.
By this point in time, he had a sizable cult following, especially as the internet started becoming more accessible. People would discuss his story on message boards and mailing lists. They scrutinized every second of his discography, meticulously documenting any findings that they came across. Just as people were wondering how long we'd have to endure this mystery, Jandek dropped a bombshell. With no warning or advertisement of any kind, Jandek performed his first live show in 2004 at a noise and music festival in Glasgow, Scotland. The only people aware of this event were a few fortunate souls who were subscribed to a Jandek mailing list. Other than them, nobody else knew it was happening until he started performing and people in the crowd started to recognize his music, exclaiming to each other that it was Jandek. The man on stage looked like a middle-aged version of the person featured on all of the album covers, all but confirming to everyone that Jandek had finally been identified. A 25-year-long manhunt was finally over, or so it seemed. The man on stage continued to refer to himself as a representative from Corwood and would never formally confirm his association with Jandek, giving us only hollow closure to one of the greatest mysteries in music history. Diving headfirst into the rabbit hole of Jandek is like traversing a maze with no map and countless dead ends that seem to keep changing their location. There are scarce resources dedicated to this subject, but there's still a devoted following of people who continue to document their experiences and findings related to Jandek. There have been multiple conspiracies levied online, such as theorizing that Corwood became a subsidiary of Interscope Records in 2003, just before Jandek's live performance shot him into the cultural zeitgeist as a way to boost the value of his records. I spent hours requesting SEC records, emailing Interscope, and trying to find any real confirmation that this deal happened. The only source that I found was a sketchy forum post that referenced an online encyclopedia from Atlanta, Georgia that has conflicting information about the matter. The most outlandish conspiracy I came across is that Elvis faked his death and 1 year later started making music under the Jandek alias. It was thought that Jandek was symbolic of a music artist without a face, something Elvis desperately wanted but was unable to accomplish. All of these theories seem elaborate and overly engineered in comparison to a more reasonable explanation. Sterling Smith is just an eccentric artist who doesn't relish in the fame and wealth associated with musicians. I tend to think Jandek is simply the alter ego of Sterling Smith, but I still hold on to some hope that Jandek imparts his account of the mystery that still eludes us to this very day.